Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you, Julie. Thanks everyone for being here. And I just put a link to the Google document in the chat so you can access it as you wish if you want to enlarge any text. I will also be doing some screen sharing. Julie, just periodically as new people come in, if you want to reshare the link so people can access it, everybody, it's open, anyone can see it. So this week's Parsha, we closed the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus. Last week in Parashat Behar, the Torah gave us the closing main mitzvot of the book of Vayikra. All of the holiness code of the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, really culminates with the laws of Shemitah, of letting the land rest every seventh year. This year is a Shemitah year. And the Jubilee, this like fundamental principle for restoring economic equity, land harmony, not overworking the land, not enabling systemic inequality to exist, etc. Having concluded the main bodies of the laws, the main body of our Parashat Bechukotai is a general recap of blessings if we follow the mitzvot as articulated throughout the book of Vayikra, if we live justly, if we live rightly and responsibly, or, God forbid, terrible curses, much longer than the blessings, much more detailed and graphic of curses if we abandon God's commandment, if we live lives of inequality, of inequity, of cruelty, of exploitation, of wealth hoarding, of abusing the land, the earth, the planet, etc., the horrific curses that will befall us. And that's really basically how the book of Vayikra comes to a close. I want to take a look at one section in the curses, chapter 26 of Vayikra, that has a little surprising element. So, trigger warning, these are graphic, really horrific curses of what could befall the people if we live unjustly. I'm going to share. And I've framed this this session as, are we accountable or are we responsible for the sins of our ancestors? And you'll see why momentarily. So the section begins, the first 14 verses are, if you observe the commandments, if you follow it, then you'll have all these blessings, you'll always have home security and food security, and the land will be lush, etc. Verse 15, things turn. If you reject my laws and spurn my rules, that's where Bechukotai is, my laws or my statutes, so that you do not observe all my commandments, you break my covenant, in turn I will do this to you, I will wreak misery upon you, etc., etc., lots of detail. And then everything escalates periodically. So you'll get all these punishments. And then by verse 18, if for all that you still don't obey me, I'll go on to discipline you sevenfold for your sins. And then there's more graphic detail for 15 more verses. And you I will scatter among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword against you. Your land shall become a desolation, and your cities a ruin, which is measure for measure, midah keneged midah, for violating the laws of Shemitah and exploiting the earth. So the land will become a ruin for us too. Eventually, those of you remaining shall melt away over their iniquity in the land of your enemies. So not only are you in exile, and not only have many of your loved ones perished already, but those of you remaining shall melt away over their own iniquity in the land of their enemies. And even over the iniquities of their ancestors with them, they shall melt away. And they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their ancestors, in that they trespassed against me and were ever so hostile to me. When I in turn have been hostile to them and have removed them into the land of their enemies, then at last shall their obdurate heart humble itself, and they shall atone for their iniquity. Then will I remember my covenant with Jacob. I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. So it comes into this premonition that eventually there will be repentance. But I want to focus on this section of verses 39 to 40, that years in, generations into ongoing, continuous irresponsibility, criminality, sin of the people, there's this very specific and I think surprising curse that we will melt away over our iniquity and also over the iniquities of our ancestors with us. And that we should have to confess our own iniquity and also the iniquities of our ancestors. I want to pause the screen share for a moment and just open up. Does this raise any questions or concerns or surprises for anyone? Before I'll tell you what concerns me about it, but I'm curious to hear from other people first. What do you make of, or how do you react to being told that on account of your ongoing sins, you will be punished for your sins and for the sins of your ancestors? And you'll have to confess your sins and the sins of your ancestors. Does that bring anything up for people? Is it surprising? Does it make sense? You can go ahead and click the raise hand button if you want to. So Gail says you want to do right by your grandchildren, creates incentive. Bamaya, contradictions. Do you want to unmute yourself and share a little more what you mean? What does that contradict?
Thank you. Well, it seems like we've read before, and I can't remember if it's Torah or Tanakh or just rabbis, but they said that like we're not supposed to be responsible for that which our forefathers have done. Like we shouldn't be bearing the weight of that sin. But it seems like we always are, like ever since Genesis, we're sort of like reaping the consequences of something that we didn't necessarily have any control over. The thing is that if this is the case, it sort of wipes away like even our current excuses, like, oh, we shouldn't have to pay reparations for slavery because I didn't own a slave. It's like, well, no, however, right? So it's really difficult for me to sort of parse all of that out, especially when you try to take Torah and apply it to today.
That's great. I mean, that's actually exactly where we're going to go with this, thinking about, the political ramification of reparations and many other contexts of interpersonal context too. But yeah, this definitely has this political, society-wise consequence. And you're raising a really obvious thing. The Book of Devarim says very explicitly, this is one of the major reforms, and you see a change within the Torah. In the Book of Devarim, in Deuteronomy, it's explicit. Children shall no longer be put to death for the sins of their parents, nor parents for the sins of their children. Each person shall be accountable for their own sins. If you really unpack in terms of biblical history, the prophet Ezekiel, introduces that as a kind of reform. Actually, if you want to speak in terms of biblical history, and the rabbinic way of kind of flattening and having everything simultaneous doesn't really account for this, but from a biblical scholarship perspective, so close your ears if you're averse to biblical scholarship. Early, the reigning idea was that it's actually an act of God's kindness to spread out punishment over the generations, that I'm not gonna, if I sin grievously, God is kind and won't dump all the punishment on me, but will spread it out. The punishment has to happen, but we'll spread it out, me and my child, my child's child, so that everybody can bear the punishment. By the time of Ezekiel, that's considered unjust and unfair. Like, why do the descendants who didn't do anything wrong have to suffer? So there's a reform, and you see that legislated in the Book of Devarim. We're going to see that in a minute, so thank you for bringing that up, B'maya, as well as the application to reparations. I want to just look in the chat for a moment. Warren also mentioned reparations. Diane mentioned we inherit the consequences of what previous generations did unless we correct what they did wrong. So maybe what God's talking about here is, it's not only that you have done bad things, but you didn't do the work to fix what you accepted what previous generations have done. We want to think about that. I saw somebody mention things about climate change. So I might say like, hey, I compost, I don't drive a car, I live in a small house, I walk places, but if I'm not doing work to repair the tremendous damage of previous industrial generations, then that I might still be responsible. Matthew says, it reminds me of the self-description of God who shows kindness to the thousands, but visits the iniquity of the fathers in the third and fourth generations. Right. This sounds like that early version that I just talked about. And what about what B'maya brought up about Devarim, that doesn't happen anymore. It sounds like original sin to me, a Christian concept. So if you climate change is a negative inheritance, we're giving a different. Okay, so I'm not going to have, lineage from ancestors. Great. Esther, last comment on this section, and then we'll go back to the text. Julie, you want to help Esther unmute?
To me, this contradicts my understanding of the klalot, because to me, the cursing comes in 5 degrees, 5 steps, and each one is like God is like an educator and gives us a chance to correct it. And so this idea of punishment that goes over actually contradicts the principal understanding of the curses.
Okay, so, and yet this is the curses. This is exactly that text. So how does this cohere? How does it intellectually make sense with the spirit of everything else that we see? So I'm going to go back to the text, the screen share. Just for a little bit of context, this context we've seen here in verse 40 that they will have to confess their own sin, their own iniquity, and also confess the iniquity of their ancestors. That's different than what we've seen in prior Vayikra, Leviticus texts about confession. Confession or declaration of sins is a trope that we've seen throughout. In the beginning, chapter 5, Parashat Tzav, it says, Nefesh ki techata, a person who sins, anyone who sins, and it lists like 4 verses of examples of different sins. I cut it out for space reasons here. Various emblematic sins. When they experience guilt for any of these matters, ki ye'esham la'achat me'eleh, I'm following Professor Jacob Milgram's understanding that when the Torah says ki ye'esham, that means the experience, the consciousness of being guilty. When they experience guilt for any of these matters, they shall confess that about which they have sinned. Individually, you personally confess that which you sinned. And then you bring a guilt offering. So you go to the temple, you make your confession. I did this. I ate pork, and now I'm remorseful. I know it was wrong, and here's my sin offering. Similarly, in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 16, the laws of purging, cleansing the altar, which by the end of the chapter get associated with the annual rite for Yom Kippur. So this annual communal purging of the altar, similarly, Aaron shall lay both his hands upon the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the Israelites and their transgressions, whatever their sins. So here it's collective, the whole list, Hashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, the whole list of everything the entire people that's gathered has sinned. But there's no mention of ancestors. The goat carries the active sins of right now, these people here who are experiencing life in the community today, and those get put on the goat to be sent off. So where is this idea in our parasha of having to confess the sins of our ancestors? So B'maya raised the contradiction, and in fact, what you were bothered by, B'maya, is exactly what Chazal, what the sages, the rabbis, are explicitly worried about. In this midrash, in the classic early 3rd century work called the Sifra, which is the Tannaitic, early rabbinic midrash on the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, and goes, phrase by phrase throughout most of the book of Vayikra, and unpacks implications legally and narratively what texts mean, especially legally. And here, on this verse that af ba'avonot avotam itam yimaku, even over the iniquities of their ancestors, with them they shall melt away. The Sifra says, but hasn't the omnipresent one, Hamakom, hasn't God promised Israel not to punish parents via their children or children via their parents? As it is said, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, parents shall not be put to death on account of children, and children shall not be put to death on account of parents. Lo yumtu avot al banim, ubanim lo yumtu al avot. If so, lama ne'amar, for what purpose was even over the iniquities of their ancestors they shall melt away said? How do we make sense of our verse? It can't be that the Torah just contradicts itself from the perspective of the rabbis. They're not going to say these are two books, two out of different times. How do we synthesize and take the truth of Devarim chapter 24 and the truth of Vayikra chapter 26? Rather, it is when they hold on to the deeds of their ancestors, generation after generation, they are judged on account of them. Bizman shehem tofsim maaseh avotam, dor achar dor dorehem, nidonim al yedehem. This also appears in the Talmud Bavli, Tractate Sanhedrin. This source is a little bit earlier, so I brought the earliest source, but it is in the Talmud and commented on by Rashi, and Rashi brings it in his biblical commentary as well. So this is a common resolution that we find throughout rabbinic literature. And I want to stop and think about, because this is really key to understanding right living in the message of our Parsha. What does it mean to hold on to the deeds of our ancestors? I mean, I'm already thinking about, if I was worried about being punished for the deeds of my ancestors, what if, let's say, my grandparents were all pretty secular, and my parents made choices in their life to start re-engaging with more of Jewish practice, and I followed and kept engaging with more of Jewish practice. My grandparents all, ate pork and shellfish and so on. I would see those to be transgressions. So really, am I supposed to be accountable for their sins according to Devarim chapter our Parsha, chapter 26? Or my grandfather smoked cigarettes. My grandmother also smoked cigarettes. I think that that's a violation of Torah's commandment to protect our lives. I don't smoke cigarettes. Am I responsible for that? So according to this resolution, it would seem no. For choices like that, they were grown people, they made their choices, and they can be responsible for their meritorious and their deleterious deeds. And I am the same. When I slander people, when I neglect my duties, my child won't bear that responsibility. She'll make her own choices. However, what if my grandparent exploited an employee, garnished wages, and then invested that money, and then bequeathed it as an inheritance to my parents? And then it continued to grow its income. And I've enjoyed false home security or food security or being free of debts. I'm not saying my grandparent did personally exploit an employee. They didn't really have employees, any of them. But there are other things. I'm not trying to get personal about my grandparents, but we can imagine, especially when we zoom this out to a whole culture, certainly the examples of reparations and slavery that were brought up, certainly the examples of planetary destruction, global warming, a lot of ways to think about this as well as particular ways. I want us to spend a few minutes really thinking about, how do we parse this out? When do we hold on? What does it mean to hold on to the deeds of our ancestors? Tofsim Maseh Avotam. And by the way, I'll also mention that that might not even be the right girsah, the right textual version of the text. Some manuscripts of the Midrash don't say tofsim, grab onto the deeds of their ancestors, they say tfusim, in the grip of the deeds of their ancestors. It may be even more expansive, that as long as, even if I haven't actively held on to something, if I am still in the grip of the sinful deeds of my ancestors, I'm judged on their account. I'm going to stop the screen share for a minute and open it up. I see Bamaya has had a hand up, and then Joanne.
Thank you, Rabbi. I think that what this does is, like we were talking about earlier, it absolutely does invalidate the argument that anyone could make today that they would not be responsible for like the lesser living conditions of African Americans in our country based on the fact that they themselves personally did not own a slave. They're not a racist person or whatever, because there's too many people that are still benefiting from the sins of the past. Like they've even studied where in a one particular instance where a Black man had managed to purchase a property, he was brought out tarred and feathered, and his property was just rolled into the property of a neighbor on a deed later. That property is still owned by that family, like a granddaughter of the person who murdered the man, and they just took the land. So it's almost impossible at this point to say that a person has zero responsibility for what's gone on in the past, even so much as like sins that garden level sins, right? Eve, Hava, like being punished with pain during childbirth or yearning for a husband that will dominate her. Like that feels very, very real to me, despite the fact that like I wasn't there, I didn't do that. Why do I have to suffer? It's like I still get to. So I'm not surely how we're writing it off as like not my problem when
Yeah,
it is.
thank you so much for that, Bamaya. Especially when we talk about these very distributed, almost disaggregated, society-wide sources of criminality, like planetary destruction and racism, that are so hard to locate in one particular atomized person, but are systemized. Let me just unpack a little bit when we talk about like systemic racism here in Chicago, where I live, on the south side or on the west side of Chicago, where for like for decades, there was legalized housing discrimination, that there were codes, prohibitions of selling to Black people. What that meant is that Black people systematically paid more for less because they had fewer areas that they were allowed to rent in, and so on, or buy property. Then those laws were mostly struck down. Race-based real estate covenants were struck down. They still happened, but it was harder for them to happen. But then in the 1950s and 60s, the Federal Housing Authority was invested in segregation, thought segregation was better for society, and drew up these maps, color coding the maps of which areas should be coded, even block by block or neighborhood by neighborhood, coded different ways, with the consequence of like, would the federal government insure mortgages to people living in those areas? So basically, exactly. So the term redlining, that was like the worst code, meaning like no mortgages will be insured in an area that was redlined. And there was redlined if there was more than one Black tenant. And so that actually created incentives for non-Black people to try to prevent Black people from moving in or to leave, to flee when Black people did come in. It also created an incentive for really disgusting criminal real estate behavior, because the federal government wouldn't insure mortgages, so the banks wouldn't give mortgages to Black people, and that created a market for contract selling, which is basically all the vulnerable parts of owning and all the vulnerable parts of renting at the same time. So you, like as an owner, are responsible for all the upkeep of your unit, but like a renter, you can be evicted for violations. for one non-payment. So people would lose all their equity all the time too. That was systemic. And we can point to like the 12 guys who were the contract sellers during the 1950s in Chicago, about half of whom were Jewish. Also, a lot of the people really opposing contract selling were also Jewish. We can pinpoint those 12 guys, but really the federal government making a decision on where to insure mortgages set up the entire system. We all pay taxes to the federal government. And we see to this day, our economy is still in the grip of those financial decisions generations later. That's just one example among many. Certainly when we talk about planetary destruction, the climate crisis, we would find similar cases where the government as an aggregate has made choices. Certainly when we talk about Haiti, when we talk about displacement and genocide of indigenous people in the United States, these are collective choices. I want to open this up to Joanne and then Michael, and then we'll bring it back to some text.
I appreciate very much the contradictions in the teachings about being responsible or not being responsible from one generation to the next. I feel like the contradictions create a more complete description of what it means to try to live rightly. Intellectually, when I'm reading the Parsha and I'm hearing about the curses, I'm like, what do you mean? How dare you? But emotionally and spiritually, psychologically, I'm like, that's really how it is for me. I would go so far as to say I don't believe there is any tikkun olam that is not about door to door, generation to generation. And in a way, I feel like the variety and the contradiction is kind of like the message of like, listen, it's all these different ways. And you can relax into the reality of the contradiction. And hopefully that will bring some light to how you can maybe continue the work of your ancestors, but not the mistakes, and not feel guilty for being a survivor.
Thanks, Joanne. And I think one of the inspiring things about what the rabbis do here is they tell us there's a tension, but it's not actually a contradiction, and that there's actually a resolution. That Devarim, saying everybody is only responsible for their own transgressions, is when your transgression is your own. And our parsha, the curses, where there's intergenerational responsibility, that's when you're continuing to hold on to or be in the grip of or maybe benefit from prior transgression. So like the examples that I gave, it was like my grandparents ate pork. That was their choice. They took a chance with, the day of judgment. Maybe it's okay. Maybe it's not. That was their life. That has nothing to do with me. But if a grandparent stole money, garnered wages, invested it, and I've now lived on that and had a leg up on the person who was wage garnered, I'm part of that sin. And so they're actually talking about two different things. And what the rabbis are pointing us to is that we don't just have to sit with the guilt. They're pointing us to the method of reparation for it, that there is both a monetary as well as a spiritual. Like you have to declare not only your own sins, like I slandered this person, I neglected this, I did that, but I haven't done my part to undo these transgressions that I was born into. And that's hard work, but they're pointing us to the way out of guilt is that declaration and that repair. Michael, and then I want to bring us back to a little bit more text to close on.
A couple points. First of all, at one level, I have a lot of discomfort of having the responsibility of someone in the past. But on the other hand, I think it's important that we, always strive to make our system work better and fairer. It also reminds me of the discussion of critical race theory, that now many states say you're not even allowed to discuss it. And whether it's true or not, I think it's a valid topic to talk about. And it also reminds me of something in an earlier portion where we're told to leave the corners of the fields for the poor, which means we're not supposed to maximize everything for ourselves. We sacrifice a little bit of our harvest to make it, to distribute it. And I think in that section, there are also a number of other either commandments or suggestions of things we're supposed to do, but not putting a stumbling block. And I think that's a principle that we could apply to making systems work better for everybody.
Great, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I actually think that, we're not going to get too into the weeds of it in our remaining 8 minutes, but thanks for bringing that up. I think the critical race theory question is actually relevant, at least in an adjacent way, because if you really boil it down, I don't want to disrespect, decades deep, rich academic theoretical fields with a 1 or 2 sentence summary, but sometimes we have to do that with all sorts of genres of work. What critical race theory basically boils down to is telling American history, reading American history through the lens of an honest appraisal of our ancestors, our forebears, racial discrimination that's been systemic, and understanding those patterns, not whitewashing. It's a lot more rich and textured than that, but in a lot of ways, that's what it boils down to, and that's what its opponents are opposing. And I don't have any more expertise than anybody here on the screen in terms of American policy and American culture. What I can say, speaking from within the biblical and rabbinic tradition, is the approach of opposing that is very foreign to biblical and rabbinic thinking, where the biblical text itself throughout displays both the points of inspiration and the downfall of the protagonists of our story. Even people as great as Moshe, certainly King David, all the forebears, according to the Ramban. Abraham sinned grievously, in the wife-sister story, and many others. Learning from the mistakes of our forebears is foundational to what biblical and rabbinic Judaism are about. So from a person who's steeped in biblical and rabbinic text, it's very hard for me, even aside from my own American politics, it's hard for me to make sense of in opposition to dealing with the legacy of, Jefferson owned lots of slaves and etc. I want to bring back to a few more texts with which to close. Second. What happens to this legacy in the later halachic tradition? Now that we've seen how the rabbis make this resolution, and that the curse in this week's parsha is pointing to our responsibility, our culpability for intergenerational political sins of which we still hold on. How do we declare these sins? There's a Talmudic passage that goes through, different rabbis have a lot of different texts of what the language should be liturgically for declaring our sins. In classic rabbinic fashion, we incorporate all of them into our machzor for Yom Kippur. But the one that is held as the essential one that Mar Zutra says, I'm going to highlight it here. Mar Zutra says, okay, all those things are only if one didn't say, indeed we have sinned, aval anachnu chatanu. If you say that, you don't need anything further. That's the basic thing, aval anachnu chatanu. Now, I want to just point out in a literary origin of that phrase to enrich our sense of culpability based on what the literary allusion is there. In modern Hebrew, or medieval till modern Hebrew, the word aval means but. In biblical Hebrew, though, and rabbinic Hebrew, the word aval is an emphatic word, more like indeed. Ach would mean but, or some other ulam in rabbinic Hebrew means but. Aval means indeed. It only appears 11 times in the Tanakh. And only one time, only twice in the Torah, and only in one biblical text with a context of admission of guilt. So I think this is what Mar Zutra is kind of drawing from when he says the foundational admission of guilt is aval anachnu chatanu. Breshit, Genesis chapter 42. Yosef is still unrecognized by his brothers. He's, the finance minister, or vice president, or whatever of Egypt, and his brothers have come begging for food, and he's messing with them. And he lays out the terms for his brothers to receive drought aid from Egypt. On the third day, Yosef said to them, "Do this and you shall live, for I am a God-fearer." Find out he's saying this all in Egyptian through a translator to continue to hide from them. "If you are honest, let one of your brothers be held in your place of detention, while the rest of you go and take home rations for your starving households. But you must bring me your youngest brother." And he tells me you have to bring back Benjamin. And Jacob already told them, "Do not bring Benjamin. It's going to kill me to let go of Benjamin." So they're like really plotting here. "You must bring me your youngest brother, that your words may be verified and that you may not die." So they did accordingly. And they said one to another, "Indeed, we are guilty, aval ashemim anachnu, on account of our brother, because we looked on at his anguish, yet paid no heed as he pleaded with us. That is why this distress has come upon us." They didn't know that Yosef understood. There was an interpreter. I want to just share with you some really sensitive comments on this passage by Rabbi Eli Confer, who is the CEO of the Hadar Institute, wonderful Torah Learning Institute, who wrote in his dissertation on interpreting Jewish liturgy, the literary intertext method. "The confession uttered by Joseph's brothers is not a general admission of guilt for vague sins. Rather, it is a direct acknowledgement of the ways in which the brothers saw Joseph suffering when kidnapping him but did not listen to him. It is also clear that the archetype sin that has been confessed to, based on this intertext, is one between people, not between a person and God. Not only that, the sin was committed years earlier. This scene offers the possibility the confession is not something that is limited to the actions of the here and now, or even the past year only. Actions that have been committed long ago can still be recalled and wrongdoing admitted. This confession is a moment of assuming collective responsibility, with the words of guilt recited by one to another, ish al achiv. Significantly, the admission is in the plural. The admission is a moment of putting aside blaming others and uniting and accepting the consequences for the action. This is significant in considering the plural language of confession and the liturgy as well. And I want to just close by showing the text in most versions of the liturgy on Yom Kippur, and in some traditions every day. Our God and God of our, this is right before the Ashamnu, Bagadnu, our God and God of our ancestors, let our prayer come before you and do not ignore our supplications. For we are not so brazen and stiff-necked that we would say before you, Adonai, our God and God of our ancestors, we are righteous and have not sinned. Indeed, we and our ancestors have sinned. When we go into Ashamnu, into the confessions, the grounding for that is we have sinned individually in all the ways in which each of us is inevitably imperfect, and that we all have complicity in intergenerational political sins of the sort of our Parsha, Parashat Vayikra. We're at time, so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a blog post, Dvar Torah, I wrote about this last year for the Avodah website. If you're interested in reading, I also go into a little bit other questions like who counts as our ancestors. That's interesting to you. And I'll turn it back to Julie for wrapping up.